Now I'm into the final part of the traditional Catholic iceberg. These are the last three tiers. These are obscure. I mean, we've already gotten through a lot of sedevacantism and a lot of conclavism, and it just keeps getting weirder and weirder and schizoer as we go down. Not everything is necessarily, terrible or schizo, but you're going to see that the further down that we are here. So first off, in tier, where are we now? This is tier 11. We have William Tapley. William Tapley is a YouTuber who goes by the name the Third Eagle of the Apocalypse, and he's a Catholic, but he prophesizes numerous stuff about the Antichrist and the end times. Then we have 8chan Christian Board. The 8chan Christian Board, well, 8chan was 4chan and Reddit combined, but not moderated, so there was a lot of shady stuff that went down on 8chan, I should say. A lot of stalking, a lot of questionable pornography, manifestos of shooters were posted there, things like that. And so there was actually a Christian board created on 8chan, and it was a dumpster fire. Next up, we have the name John the 23rd is cursed. Next up, we have the name John the 23rd is cursed, and this comes from that there were multiple anti-popes called John the 23rd before the official John the 23rd who opened the Second Vatican Council. Next up, we have J. Dyer was a SETI. J. Dyer is an interesting figure. He promotes a lot of conspiracy theories, and he is a traditional capital O Eastern Orthodox. Apparently, at one point, he was the member of the Most Holy Family Monastery, and he calls them the Trailer Park Monastery. J. Dyer tries to debate a lot of normal Catholics and traditional Catholics of various levels of rejection of the papacy, and he's just generally a pretty aggressive guy. He has a big backstory, and a lot of his backstory is pretty scandalous, and arguably I would call him a lolcow. Next up, we have Michael Voris and E. Michael Jones were paid off to aid the Society of St. Pius X. This is a weird conspiracy that goes up that there's this rich donor that goes to the Fraternity of St. Peter who has a personal grudge with the Society of St. Pius X, and the reason that Michael Voris and E. Michael Jones made anti-Society of St. Pius X content is because they are paid off. Next up, we have the conspiracy theory known as Twin Paul VI's. So, early on in the 70s, in sedevacantism, there was this idea that there were two Paul VI's. There was the real Paul VI, who was the true pope, and then there was a duplicate Paul VI that was the anti-pope that promulgated Vatican II and promulgated the new sacraments. And so you could tell in, I guess, photographs of Paul VI that these were two Paul VI because you measure his ear length and stuff like that, or his nose length, and you're able to tell that this is in fact a body double of Paul VI. The real Paul VI was, of course, held as a prisoner in the basement of the Vatican until he died in 1978, and that plays into Palmarianism, which we'll get to later. Next up, we have Bishop Tissier de Monterey is silenced and held hostage. So Bishop Tissier is a bishop in the Society of St. Pius X. He is sickly, and he wrote the biography of Archbishop Lefebvre. So anyway, when the whole thing with Williamson being expelled and the resistance came up, there was this weird internet rumor that he was held hostage and silenced because he believed that Benedict XVI was a heretic and that Bishop Williamson was in the right, but he was sickly, so he couldn't stand up for himself, and he was silenced and held hostage. Now we have the late Bishop Dolan's schism with Bishop Sanborn. Bishop Dolan was one of the 9. Bishop Sanborn was one of the 9. They were for a period in the Society of St. Pius V, then they broke off. Both were separately consecrated in took holy orders and became bishops, and so Bishop Dolan ran the large Sedevacantist parish, St. Gertrude the Great in Westchester, Ohio, which is part of the Cincinnati area. And so Bishop Dolan was a pure Sedevacantist. Bishop Sanborn was a Sede-Privationist, and so towards the end of Bishop Dolan's life, he started a public spat with Bishop Sanborn and considered him basically halfway Novus Ordo or something like that. Of course, Bishop Dolan died shortly thereafter. Next up, we got Vatican covered up that Fatima was a false prophecy when the third secret prophecies about Portugal did not come true. So prior to the release of the official third secret, there was bits and texts of the third secret that people said that they saw, and one of the parts of these texts or rumored texts was that Portugal would not lose the faith. And so that phrase is not in the official third secret of Fatima. So perhaps there's a conspiracy that the third secret of Fatima was a false prophecy that talked about Portugal, and none of that stuff panned out, so the Vatican basically made up the released third secret. Okay, Archbishop Took was kidnapped. So Archbishop Took, we talked about him a lot. There's a question of the validity of his holy orders. He was really late in his life when he became a Sedevacantist. He was really isolated. And it ended up that he died in a Franciscan monastery of Vietnamese exiles, and that he was fully reconciled with John Paul II and the post-councilor Vatican. So one of these things that goes about in Sedevacantist circles is that Archbishop Took is a victim of elder abuse, and so people that support the Society of St. Pius V are anti-Took orders. They'll say, well, he consecrated people because he was a victim of elder abuse. And look, as soon as he got away from these traditionalists, he went back and he acknowledged John Paul II as the Pope. Right? But the Sedevacantists point back, they say, no, these Vietnamese Franciscans kidnapped Took, and he was never reconciled, and it was all fake, and he died a Sedevacantist. Next up, we have the Society of St. Pius X and Sedevacantist annulment courts. We already talked about the crisis in annulments that has happened after Vatican II, and how there's been this huge increase in annulments that have been given out by the regular church. Well, turns out that the Society of St. Pius X and the CMRI, and I think other Sedevacantists, literally tried to judge these annulments of the diocesan bishops and decide on their own if they're real or not. Next up, similar to Paul VI and the idea of two Paul VI, a fake Paul VI and a real Paul VI, there's this idea of two Sister Lucias. Sister Lucia was, of course, one of the children in Fatima, one of the seers of Our Lady, and so Sister Lucia died in a Carmelite order after not saying that much stuff publicly throughout her life. And so there are these pictures of Sister Lucia that are supposed to show that there's two Sister Lucias and that there are two great distinctions between them. And so there's this idea that Sister Lucia wasn't a Sedevacantist or didn't break away from the Carmelite order that she was in because she would have been a traditionalist, and so on, and that you can tell this because there are two Sister Lucias. Well, turns out that Sister Lucia had a pretty major surgery, and that's the explanation of the differences between the two Sister Lucias. Next up, we have many church fathers were anti-natalist. Of course, Catholicism is viewed as a pretty pro-natalist religion today, but many of the church fathers had a pretty low opinion of sex. Not just sex in terms of outside of the context of marriage, sexual sins, if you will, and viewing chastity as a very great thing. They were outright anti-natalist and condemned sex pretty harshly. Next up, we have the anti-Last Temptation of Christ attacks in France. So, The Last Temptation of Christ is a very controversial movie with Nestorian and adoptionist ideas and influence from Gnosticism. It's based off of a book originally written in Greek, The Last Temptation of Christ. And so Martin Scorsese adopted the movie, and it came out in 1987. When it came out, some traditionalist Catholics burned down movie theaters in France to protest the release of the film because it was widely viewed as blasphemous. Keep in mind, in the film, Jesus has sex, marries Mary Magdalene, who is explicitly depicted as a prostitute, doesn't know that he is the true God, and is literally adopted by God, advocates overthrowing the Roman Empire by force, and the greatest apostle and the one that he's the closest to is Judas Iscariot, and that the traitorship, the Judas kiss of Jesus that led to his crucifixion was in fact an inside job, and Jesus told Judas to do it for him. And the last act of the film is Jesus listening to Satan and falling to temptation. Okay, Archbishop Took wanted communion to be taken with chopsticks. So Archbishop Took eventually declared sedevacantism. He consecrated the Palmarian bishops. He reconsecrated old Catholic bishops that wanted Catholic orders. And he consecrated 3 sedevacantist priests to become sedevacantist bishops, and the majority of sedevacantist holy orders come from him. So he was a super radical traditionalist, right? Turns out at Vatican II that's not the case. He advocated some pretty odd liturgical reforms and was seen as a liberal reforming bishop at the council. So one of the things that he advocated is that East Asian peoples should have a new liturgy written for them in their cultural context. And within this new liturgy, they would receive the Eucharist with chopsticks. So some people have said that Archbishop Took wasn't necessarily traditionalist in the Catholic sense. He was just far right politically, and he saw traditional Catholics as allies. Keep in mind his brother was the dictator of South Vietnam, and that's the reason he got exiled in Europe in the first place. Lay people own most Society of St. Pius X and SETI churches and trusts. So I don't know if this is necessarily the case anymore, but I know historically a lot of traditionalist churches were held in trust, especially amongst SETIs. And the reasoning for that is because when the traditionalist movement started and there was a bunch of wandering traditionalist priests who either were kicked out by their bishops stopped supporting them, and they're just kind of on their own or whatever, started up their own churches, it would start out with them doing masses in garages or masses in hotels, and over time their followers would get money, and their followers would buy old churches, either Catholic or Protestant, and then they would move into these old churches, refurbish them, and then they would become traditional Catholic churches. And when they got the money together, it was in fact lay investors who would share the churches in trusts. And so one of the things that happened when the 9 were kicked out of the Society of St. Pius X is that the Society of St. Pius X didn't gain control over those churches that the 9 were. And in fact, the lay people own those churches, and so the 9, or then the Society of St. Pius V, actually had a lengthy court battle over ownership of the churches. This kind of might go into the whole idea of not being able to rejoin full communion with Rome. Because keep in mind, when Bishop Fillet was in communications with the Vatican to see if they would go into fully restored communion with Rome, there was this discussion of, is he going to sell out the Society of St. Pius X? And I think what was whispered is how much of the Society of St. Pius X would go with him. Of course, there was the whole resistance movement that broke off, and Williamson left, and Williamson is now consecrated bishops. But the Society of St. Pius X doesn't necessarily control all its churches. And if the Society of St. Pius X went into full communion even this day with the Pope, there's a high likelihood that large elements of it would break off, and churches of it that are not owned by the society would break off. Maria Divine Mercy. Maria Divine Mercy is a woman who claims to receive messages from Virgin Mary, from Jesus from various figures, and she has released these revelations or visions publicly but anonymously as Maria Divine Mercy. That's her pen name. So anyway, her prophecies include a lot of radical traditional Catholic stuff. She's not a full-blown sedevacantist, but she's pretty anti-Vatican II, thinks the Masons did it. She believes that Benedict XVI was a real pope, was still the pope when Francis was elected, and that she believes in benevacantism. She believes the whole Paul VI was a prisoner, John Paul II was a prisoner kind of thing. She's supposed to be from Ireland, but nobody knows her real name, or at least it hasn't been publicly released as far as I know. Next up is John Paul II was a prisoner in the Vatican. This goes with the whole two Paul VI's thing, that after Paul VI was a prisoner in the Vatican and there was a duplicate Paul VI, then John Paul I is elected, then he dies mysteriously, then John Paul II is elected, but it turns out he's a prisoner in the Vatican and that he's under hostage. It's interesting because you have the whole Siri hypothesis that Siri was elected pope and then he was under hostage and he couldn't publicly say he was the pope. And then you have a lighter version that John Paul II actually is the pope, but he's also under hostage. So we already talked about Malachi Martin, who's a very interesting figure, and he wrote the next entry in the Iceberg, which is the Windswept House, and fully is the Windswept House is literally history. So Malachi Martin wrote several novels later in his life that he described as faction, and this is the most famous one. He alleged that the events in his novel, they're real events and they're real people, and it's told in the form of a non-fiction novel or a faction novel. So here, roughly 85% of the fictional characters mirror real people, and roughly 85% of the events in the book mirror real events, except those which are obviously mythic, such as the final stay of the Slavic Pope in Poland. We are talking about real events and real people masked in the form of a novel. Nowadays it's called faction, a term coined by Norman Mailer, but an art form really created by Taylor Caldwell. And so in the book he says that Vatican II was done by an enslavement or an enthronement of Lucifer, a satanic ritual conducted by higher-up members of the Catholic Church who are probably Freemasons, which leads to the crisis that's going on now, and that there's a secret satanic cabal within the Church, and that John Paul II is this heroic, embattled pope who's going to fight to the last to defend Catholicism. You know, all good stuff, all interesting stuff in a thriller novel, and that's what it is. But because he said it was faction, then some people think it's real. Next up we have Home Aloners. Home Aloners are a pretty extreme branch of sedevacantism. The name comes from Home Alone because they stay at home on Sunday and they don't go to church. They don't receive the sacraments other than baptism or marriages that are done by witnesses. And so Home Aloners basically think sedevacantism, but that there's no emergency that allows priests to be ordained, bishops to be consecrated, confession to be done, and so jurisdiction went extinct with the popes, and so it's a sin to go to church, it's a sin to go to confession, because jurisdiction is extinct and you don't need to do that. So basically, Vatican II blew up the entire church, and clergy are now extinct because the popes can't recognize bishops as in their diocese. Bishops don't have jurisdiction, therefore bishops can't ordain priests. Therefore, the bishops can't give the priests the faculties to do confession because the Pope never gave the bishops the faculties to do so. And so they basically just sit at home and do nothing and wait for the end of the world to come. This is an interesting aside. As I already talked, that there are parallels within Eastern Orthodoxy, capital O Orthodoxy, between the old calendarist and the traditional Catholics. And here again with Home Aloners, you have the parallel between the old believers in Russian Orthodoxy, which left the Orthodox Church following liturgical reforms in the 17th century, and some of which don't have holy orders, they don't have priests, and effectively believe the apostolic succession is extinct, and the more extreme brand of sedevacantists who are home aloners that believe apostolic succession has gone extinct. Sedevacantism is an American phenomenon. Now, there are signs that it's spreading into Latin America, and as I said before, I don't really have that much access to sedevacantist stuff on the internet outside of my own native English, but it appears overwhelmingly that sedevacantism is in the United States of America, and in fact, where it's in other countries, it's because those countries are close to America, so it's bleeding over into Canada, and it's bleeding over into Mexico because of the close connections that the United States has with the countries that border it. And this is contrasted with the Society of St. Pius X and the indult groups, which are pretty global. The Society of St. Pius X is the biggest in France, but also the second biggest in the United States. I want to kind of make an asterisk there. But when you go to Europe, there definitely is a lot more people that go to the Society of St. Pius X than go to sedevacantists. And some people think that there is a cultural thing behind this. And so if you step out of Catholicism and step into a study of religions, you'll look at the United States and you see that there are numerous different church bodies for every form of Protestantism. And there are five jurisdictions of Eastern Orthodox in competition with each other. And so the religious landscape, because of the history of religious liberty in the United States, is very fragmented. There are numerous Baptist denominations, numerous Lutheran denominations, the Episcopal Church, but numerous continuing Anglican denominations. And so they see this kind of parallel going on, and you could see sedevacantism as a reflection of this within the Catholic Church, and that there are numerous sedevacantist groups that are opposed to what you could say is the mainline Catholic Church. The mainline Catholic Church, of course, being the regular Catholic Church, the Novus Ordo, if you will. Think about this as the Novus Ordo that is the Evangelical Church in America, and sedevacantists are the Missouri Synod, or something similar to that. Likewise, in the United States, there's independent Baptists. They're in other countries, but they're really big here. So you have liberal Baptists, and you have Southern Baptists, and you have different Baptist denominations, and likewise you have different sedevacantist denominations. And you'll see Baptists in mini malls and in business buildings and stuff like that, having their churches, and you see that with the traditional Catholics, how they'll have Mass in garages or Mass in hotels. And so that there's kind of this cultural cross-pollination from the more rigorous and more hardcore Protestants to Catholicism, and that cross-pollination is sedevacantism. Now that's kind of a sociological theory, but take it as you will. It's an interesting thought. Next up, we have the last one for this tier list, and that is the Vatican website is GeoCities tier, and it should be preserved. The Vatican website isn't that slick right now. It's pretty good if you want to find stuff and read it, and documents are posted in numerous languages to evangelize for people throughout the world, but the current Vatican website seems pretty dated. So the idea here is that we not only need tradition in the liturgy, we need tradition to preserve the dated 1990s style Vatican website. And I think there's a great bit of irony here too, because Tradition in Action, Anne Barnhart's blog, The Remnant, and Most Holy Family Monastery, these are old DIY, dated 1990s, older websites that look fairly dated compared to new corporate slick websites. And, all these people that are critical of the Vatican, I just kind of find it funny, because when you go to the Vatican website, it can double as like Griff Ruby's website. It can double as the Most Holy Family Monastery or Tradition and Action's website. It's just as old, just as dated. And you know what? That kind of makes me think that the Vatican is the true Catholic Church, because all these people pointing at it and saying it's given out on Catholicism, well, its website is just as traditionalist as any traditionalist blog. And that will finish Tier 11. And now let's get to Tier 12. Tier 12, we're really deep down here into the abyss. So the first one of Tier 12 is JP2 will be resurrected as the Antichrist, in quotes. So this is actually a prophecy of the Most Holy Family Monastery, and it starts out with John Paul II was prophesied by them to be the Antichrist. Well, John Paul II died before he could become the Antichrist. And so that led into some interesting cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is, of course, when you hold something to be true and it turns out that reality is the opposite. And so you have this cognitive dissonance, this very strong contradiction going on in your head where you're trying to justify this unreality of this firmly held belief coming to be debunked. And so cognitive dissonance actually comes from the examination of a cult, the UFO cult in Chicago called the Seekers, which predicted an imminent apocalypse, and it's recorded by sociologists in the book When Prophecy Fails, when the prophecy of the end of the world held by the small UFO cult fell through. And so you see this cognitive dissonance coming up with the Diamond Brothers. They are super aggressive set of occultists who believe that the end of the world is intimate and we're living in the final parts of Revelation, and so they're interpreting all these prophecies of minor things to be these big mysterious things in Revelation, and they think that John Paul II is the Antichrist, and that his enthronement of the Antichrist was actually the Assisi prayer meeting. But John Paul II died before he could become the Antichrist. So what are they going to do about that? They already declared that he was the Antichrist, but it ended up that that prophecy fell through because he died. Are they going to bite the bullet and say their prophecy failed? They have cognitive dissonance and they have to come up with something in its wake. And so the Most Holy Family Monastery thinks that John Paul II will be resurrected and rule the world as the Antichrist. Next up we have Malachi Martin was a bishop. And this comes at the end of Malachi Martin's life, and this comes with a lot of the controversies that's associated with him. He supposedly was consecrated in old Catholic orders, or was consecrated and took orders that weren't publicly done, because there's also supposed to be these took bishops that don't have any documentation that they're took bishops, or that Malachi Martin was actually consecrated a bishop, and he was supposed to be some kind of underground bishop in communist Europe or something like that. And so it's interesting, and what comes up with this is that would mean that Malachi Martin had become a full-blown set of occultist before he died. Next up, we have Pope Francis's personal devotion to Archbishop Lefebvre, and this is an interesting thing. I saw one time in an article or an interview about the dialogue between the Holy See and the Society of St. Pius X, that Pope Francis told Bishop Fillet that he had read Archbishop Lefebvre's biography that was written by Bishop Tissier twice, and that he found Archbishop Lefebvre to be a very interesting and inspirational person. And so Pope Francis, what does he have, some kind of devotion to Archbishop Lefebvre? Next up, we have Archbishop Lefebvre was a Sedevadoutist. We already talked about Sedevadoutism. Sedevadoutism is basically Sedevacantism, but you don't believe that lay people can dethrone the Pope. You don't believe that lay people have the authority to depose the Pope, and so you don't think that you have the authority to depose the Pope. You say that he's probably not the Pope, but doubtful in the end whether he's a Pope or not. And so very early on, there's this idea that Archbishop Lefebvre was friends with many Sedevacantists in the 70s, that he had Sedevacantist professors at his seminaries, and he flirted with it, and he said, I don't say that Paul VI is not the Pope, but I don't say you can't say that he's not the Pope. which in French has all these P's, and so it sounds pretty humorous because every word in that begins with P. So anyway, Father Shikata actually made a video about this and said that his opinions about sedevacantism were influenced by Archbishop Lefebvre, and he's actually said, I know he's deceased now, but he used to say that basically the Society of St. Pius X is kind of like this interim thing, and that Archbishop Lefebvre never really thought out his positions and became a full sedevacantist, and that the Society of St. Pius X is just kind of one stepping stone into sedevacantism. Next up we have Infiltration Was Plagiarized. Infiltration is the book that Taylor Marshall wrote, and how he has this conspiracy theory that there are various organizations that penetrated the Catholic Church, infiltrating it and undermined it from within. And that's the problem that's going on with the church. And so the idea that Infiltration was plagiarized is that it's just this kind of grift book where he didn't do any research and he basically just plagiarized everyone else's research. Next up we have All Hobbies Are a Sin. And this is an opinion that's held by the man that does Ascent of Mount Carmel. And the Ascent of Mount Carmel is a smallish traditional Catholic YouTube channel. Sometimes the guy says some stuff that's pretty out there and radical, but it seems like mainly he goes to Mass at the Society of St. Pius X, as far as I can tell. He's really prolific. He's posted numerous videos over the past 10 years. And he has some interesting opinions, and the most famous of his interesting opinions that he insists on really hard is that all hobbies are a sin. And so at one point he was posting on Twitter, and it became this huge ordeal where he was insisting on numerous people that all hobbies were a sin. Most of the traditional Catholics on Twitter, big names, ended up trying to debunk him and posted numerous things against him, and I think he lost a lot of followers on his YouTube channel and Twitter channel as a result. Generally, though, I think that there is some good content on there. Just take it with a grain of salt. Next up, we have lots of people left sedevacantism when Benedict XVI was Pope. The most famous defection that I know of was that a large part of the nuns that were in the Congregation of Mary the Immaculate Queen returned to the normal Catholic Church when Benedict XVI was Pope. And this is just kind of a thing that also happened when John Paul II became Pope. When you have, I guess, in the minds of sedevacantists or more radical traditionalists, these more conservative Novus Ordo popes, you see a lot of people that took more radical positions during Paul VI's papacy or John Paul II's papacy, and now during Francis's papacy, walk back when there's a lot of clarification in these conservative Novus Ordo popes. And so it seems that sedevacantism is kind of like a drainage pipe for people that are really scandalized by what's going on in the papacy at any given time. And when there's a pope that clarifies stuff, then a lot of people end up leaving sedevacantism, or they end up being these independent traditionalists will rejoin and go into full communion with the church. Next up, we have a super cursed place, RX traditionalism. R/ is, of course, a page on Reddit. And so there's this page on Reddit that's X-Traditionalism, which is devoted to saying that Catholic traditionalism, and I'm not talking about like the Palmarian Church or even the Society of St. Pius V. We're talking about, going to the indult Mass. Basically, just being a regular Catholic to these people is just as much as a mind-controlling cult as Jim Jones. And so this is an extremely cursed place. And part of the problem is that traditional Catholicism by people that are in the far right is seen as a religion that they would like to join. And many of the people in the far right are very unstable, and they tend to jump in between ideologies, and they tend to jump in between religions. And so you have these people that were far right for a summer that are mentally unstable, and they picked up traditional Catholicism. They may have not even converted, but they may have just sat in the back of Mass a few times, or they may have just followed the Diamond Brothers online and they never really converted, and so now they're ex-traditionalist. And so because they're so mentally unstable, then they change their ideology again, and now they're leftists, and now they're going to try and be as anti-Catholic as they can be. I know that there are some people that are cradle Catholics on there. They're also on ex-traditionalism. Just stay away from that place. It's not the brightest place in the internet. It's a very dark place. Next up, we have the phrase, more Catholic than the anti-pope. And this is just kind of a meme phrase I made up. Because historically, you have the slur against Catholics that are traditionalists. Well, you're more Catholic than the Pope. Or it's the saying that I've heard before. And so now you have, you're more Catholic than the anti-pope. You're more Catholic than the conclavist. I guess the sedevacantist could say, well, we're more Catholic than the anti-pope. So I included that because I thought it was rather funny. Next up, we have Father Cicada and Bishop Daniel Dolan were in a relationship. And so this is a odd thing. This is part of the scandals and rumors that followed the rivalry between the Took consecrated clergy or affiliated clergy. Some of them were originally ordained in the regular church or ordained in the Society of St. Pius X, but are running around with all these bishops that descend in their orders from Bishop Took. And you have the Society of St. Pius V on the other side, and you have this whole smorgasbord of Cincinnati and having all these rival traditionalist churches that are opposed to each other, and people that were scorned from St. Gertrude the Great in that area. They started to make up rumors about Father Cicada and Daniel Dolan, both are deceased now, being in a gay relationship. Next up, we have Novus Ordo baptisms are invalid. This is an idea that's held by some more rather extreme sedevacantists and members of traditionalism. They believe that the mainstream Catholic Church no longer believes in baptism the way that the Church traditionally did it, and so their baptisms are doubtful or questionable. In the Society of St. Pius V, they have everybody rebaptized. It's called conditional rebaptism. Next up, we have Japanese home aloners. And so this actually wasn't something I was aware of. When I made the Twitter list of people giving me stuff, suggestions to put on here, numerous people put Japanese home aloners. And so I heard from the Society of St. Pius X resistance priests debating sedevacantism. They're talking about how there were all these Japanese sedevacantists that weren't receiving sacraments because there wasn't sedevacantist priests there. So maybe that's what Japanese home aloners mean, or perhaps they're talking about hidden Christians. And hidden Christians are the Catholics in Japan that after Catholicism was banned and very aggressively persecuted, and numerous people were martyred in the 17th century, and the religion was basically banned throughout the Tokugawa shogunate, and it didn't end until 1873, until the Meiji Restoration. And so effectively Catholicism was banned for about over 2 centuries in Japan, but Christians continued to believe, and they continued to have a Catholic heritage to them, and that they would have these secret symbols that were Catholic. They would have these statues of Mary holding Jesus, which from the outside looked to be Buddha, but if you looked at them closely, you could see that they were Catholic. And because they were cut off from the rest of the church, kind of like these synchronistic parts entered into the faith. And so like influences from Buddhism and influences from Shintoism entered into it, but there were thousands of these secret Catholics in Japan, and they were essentially home aloners because the clergy that were coming to Japan when there was this initial conversion in the 17th century, the 1600s, of a lot of Japanese people to Catholicism, most of those missionary priests were Jesuits, and so the Jesuit order pulled back because so many people were being martyred. If you read the book Silence, it talks about how a few Jesuits ended up reneging and not being martyred and apostatized and became Shinto or Buddhists. And so it seemed that the faith in Japan had fallen, that the gospel had failed. But that wasn't true. The gospel hasn't failed, and that there were thousands of Japanese Christians the whole time that were hidden to the West that we didn't know about. Next up, we have trads publicly attacking Francis only makes things worse. And so this is a statement I've seen from a lot of, say, indult Catholics being really upset with people that stir up a lot of controversy. People like Taylor Marshall, people like Michael Voris, who are very confrontational with bishops and priests. And that basically they tarnish these good indult traditionalists, and that they're going to end up getting everything revoked, which of course happened in Traditionalist Custodes. And it's just kind of interesting because it's like this battered wife syndrome, kind of, because it's like they know that what's going on with Pope Francis, that's not good, but they're not going to speak up against it because they're afraid of losing the Latin Mass and losing the indult. Next up, we have the Ukrainian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church, which is a very bizarre sedevacantist group. It's made up of Eastern Rite, Ukrainian Rite Catholics who broke away from the mainstream Catholic Church in Ukraine in 2009, and they started to believe in a lot of sedevacantist stuff, like episcopal consecrations being invalid. They, of course, declared Benedict XVI, Francis, and John Paul II as anti-popes. And there's all this idea that they're financed by Russia to be against the Ukrainian government. It's just odd. And apparently it says that they chose to elect Archbishop Vigano as their pope, which means that they would technically be conclavists now. Most of the people within that order or that church were actually members of a monastic order. They were members of the Order of St. Basil the Great, or the Bastilian Order of St. Jehoshaphat. Interesting. I don't know that much about them. They're just this side thing in sedevacantism that are off on their own. This Eastern Rite sedevacantism, which has nothing to do with the whole Western Rite with Took and with the Society of St. Pius V, and I don't think that the two sides have anything to do with each other. Next up, we have Cafeteria trad. So there's the idea of the Cafeteria Catholic, who takes only the certain things that they want, usually a liberal Catholic, and will say, I believe that a woman can have abortion, but I really like this stuff about helping the poor, and I believe in receiving the sacraments, and that it's the real presence of Christ. And so they're picking and choosing what they want to believe about the church. Well, you have Cafeteria trads, and I've seen this on Catholic Match, that there were girls that were looking at on Catholic Match. It's embarrassing to say that I used that out loud on this YouTube video, but there were girls on there that would believe in, women's ordination and would believe in gay marriage, but they would say, I like the Latin Mass because it's pretty. You also have kind of like this undercurrent of gays. I already talked about the whole pink mafia thing of gays that really like liturgical stuff, so I guess you could put them there into that whole Cafeteria trad category. Next up, we have Pope Michael II. So we already talked about Pope Michael David Bodwin, who died recently. Well, it turns out that his career as an anti-pope, he's been succeeded by a Filipino claimant to the papacy, and that guy goes by Michael too. And so that there's this line of anti-popes now that are descending from Pope Michael, and we're just going to have to see as the years go on where that goes. Okay, next up we have the Avignon popes, were the true successors to St. Peter. There's not really that much to say about it after that. After the Great Schism, the Great Western Schism, ended with the Council of Constance, and several of the pretenders gave up their papacy, the Avignon popes ran off and didn't give up their papacy. And so there was actually secession for some time of Avignon popes that's believed to have gone extinct. There was John Respal of Camp of the Saints fame actually wrote an alternative history novel where there were still claimants to the Avignon papacy. Anyway, there's not that much to it, just the idea that it turns out that their claims were true and the papacy actually is extinct because the Roman claimants to the papacy were wrong and the Avignon popes were right. Next up, we have Apostles of Infinite Love. The Apostles of Infinite Love are an interesting French group. I went onto their website and they don't say anything about this, but from my understanding, they were founded by Michel Colline, who was a French priest who claimed to be Pope Clement the 15th and received this proclamation of his papacy as a conclavist through mysticalism. He was given the papal tiara in a mystical vision, and apparently there's a successor in a Gregory the 18th that has succeeded him, and that's the current pope. But when I went onto their website, there was nothing about them having their own pope, so I don't know. Again, this is a problem because this is all in French, and I am an English speaker, but there seems to be a conclavist traditional Catholic group which has multiple churches in multiple countries out there, and which is pretty similar to Palmer de Troya, but probably more successful. Next up, we have Sedevacantism developed in an ad hoc fashion years after the council. So here's the thing about this. Most of the people that left the council, even if they didn't like what happened in Vatican II, they didn't become Sedevacantists. There's only one bishop after Vatican II that's even said to have become Sedevacantist, and there's some doubts because Archbishop Took is also said to have fully reconciled before his death. And so nobody really was Sedevacantist in 1965. I talked about this a little bit earlier. There are small groups of Sedevacantists that started out in the 1970s, but over time people came to the whole Sedevacantist conclusion in the 1970s and the 1980s, long after Pius XII would have became the last pope. And so Sedevacantism was realized at least a decade after it would have happened to most Sedevacantists. Finally, we have the Diamond Brothers are the two witnesses. There's the two witnesses in the book of Revelation that will come during the end times. And so in a lot of apocalyptic groups and in Christian eschatology, because it's such a cryptic thing in the book of Revelation, has been made, and numerous people and even groups have been claimed to be the two witnesses. Most commonly, the two witnesses are said to be Enoch and Elijah, because in the Bible they're assumed to heaven, and it's believed that they'll come back down to heaven as the two witnesses at the end of time. In the medieval times, it was believed that the two witnesses were in fact the Dominican and Franciscan order, and that the end times were upon us, and that these reformist orders were the two witnesses that would proclaim the true faith in the world of the Antichrist. And so, right now, there are two brothers that run a very famous apostolate, the Most Holy Family Monastery, and so there's this idea that the Diamond Brothers are the two witnesses to the apocalypse. To my understanding, they've never said that they're the two witnesses themselves, but their followers sometimes think that they're the two witnesses, and I don't think that they've ever contradicted their followers either. And so that ends tier 12, and that puts us into the last tier, tier 13. There's some cursed stuff going on here in tier 13. I kind of put the Keys of St. Peter in a famous painting there as the picture because, yeah, you read through all this. Now let's actually be Catholic. You know all this crazy stuff, and that's just kind of an Easter egg I put on the end. After the succeeding pictures got more and more dire, more and more crazy, I finally put the Keys of St. Peter. And good job because you read through all of it. And thank you so much, everybody that's stuck around to this point, been listening to these videos, and I'm right about to start it here. Let's start it. Michael Lofton is the infallible interpreter of the magisterium. And of course, as we all know, what good is an infallible magisterium without its infallible interpreter? Loft Dog is top dog. Nobody believes this, but Michael Lofton has started a lot of controversy, let's just say, in the Catholic community at large, and a lot of people don't like him. And so he takes like this Pope-splaining to a whole nother level in a lot of people's eyes. And so the meme has come up that he sees himself as the infallible interpreter of the magisterium. Next up we have Our Lady of Naju. Our Lady of Naju is a condemned apparition that's set in South Korea, with the seer being Julio Kim. It's been condemned, and Julio Kim has been excommunicated. She's supposed to have received the stigmata, and she's at odds with the church, and it's kind of the Medjugorje of Asia. But what's associated with Our Lady of Naju is pictures of statues of Mary, or pictures of Mary covered in blood. And a lot of people, me included, that see this, it's very upsetting, and I really don't like it. Next up we have Father Shikata Killed Terry Schiavo. Now, this is probably scandalous. The late Father Shikata obviously didn't kill Terry Schiavo, so I exaggerated this for humor. But Father Shikata argued that she should be taken off life support and no longer fed, which is probably by far his most controversial opinion throughout his entire papacy. Far more controversial than sedevacantism or the whole Unacum thing. For those that don't know, or were Zoomers that were not aware at the time, Terry Schiavo was a very tragic case of a woman who received very traumatic brain injuries following a heart attack. And so her husband, and was her legal guardian, and her husband wanted these extraordinary means that helped her to stay alive to end, while her parents and her family opposed that and supported keeping extraordinary means to keep her alive. And so she was deemed to be in a persistent vegetative state, but a lot of people that supported Terry Schiavo's family believed that she was severely brain damaged, but she had been not fully put into coma or the persistent vegetative state, and this was just a label. And that she was really, say, like the state of an infant, like a very young child, and that she had some awareness. So anyway, there was a long legal battle, and then in the 2000s, eventually the husband gained the upper hand, and he removed the feeding tube, and it took days, weeks for her to die, and it was extremely painful. And it was this extremely controversial thing at the time, and that a lot of pro-life people took the side of Terry Schiavo's family. Next up, we have another theory of the Diamond Brothers, probably my favorite. Paul VI's signature is the mark of the beast, and this, just like John Paul II will be resurrected as the Antichrist, is a highly dubious claim. And they make this claim because the signature of Paul VI, Pope Paul VI, when flipped upside down, looks like the Arabic numerals for 666. And so the mark of the beast was interpreted by the Diamond Brothers to be the signature of Paul VI, and him signing off on the documents of Vatican II and the changes to the liturgy. That is in fact the mark of the beast 666 in the book of Revelation. Next up we have everyone goes to heaven but trads go to hell. And this is in quotation marks. And this is one of those things that's kind of a meme, but it's really hard to point it out, and so I had to just write it out. And this is the idea that a lot of liberal Catholics try to gaslight trads and say that they're the worst people, right? And so this is the idea of the super liberal Catholic that believes that only the mean people, the regressives, if you will, are the people that go to hell. And because trads are more likely to go to hell, they kind of gaslight trads and say, why are you critical of Pope Francis? Don't you know that that's going to get you into hell? And they use kind of like as a bludgeon to trads fidelity to the Pope to try and push liberalism on them. Okay, next up we have Taylor Marshall's Q-on appearance. And so there's been a lot of fan art, for whatever reason, of Taylor Marshall on K-On. I don't understand it, but apparently it's a big deal. Pretty cool. I'm glad that he was able to appear on an anime. That just shows he's mega based. Next up, we have pre-2011 English translation loyalists. So in case you didn't know, the English translation of the Novus Ordo Mass was redone in 2011 under Benedict XVI's papacy to be closer to the Latin. And a lot of liberals, who tended to be a lot older, I will say, were really up in arms about this and thought it was terrible. So I put this here as like, these are the real traditionalists, the people that will not stand for this 2011 English translation of the Novus Ordo Mass. Next up, we have the Big Daddy, the big conclavist, Big Daddy. You know what I'm talking about. The Palmer de Troya movement, the Palmarian Christian Church, the Palmarian Catholic Church. This is the poxmark of sedevacantism and the poxmark of traditional Catholicism, and is a tragedy. So this is a schismatic cult in Spain that is conclavist. It was founded by a man, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Clement Dominguez y Gomez, who was a visionary who said that he saw various apparitions, most importantly Our Lady, following the Marian apparitions of Our Lady of Palmer. The Marian apparitions of Our Lady of Palmer are kind of interesting because some people say that they happened but don't follow Palmer de Troya. And so there were these 4 girls that allegedly first saw the Virgin Mary. But anyway, the whole thing gets taken over by this blind guy, Clement Dominguez y Gomez, and he says that he's seeing Mary and that she's giving him mystical visions. So anyway, it's all lay people, and there's no priests, and so they approach Archbishop Took, who's in exile and who's really isolated, and they're part of the traditionalist movement, and they ask for Took to consecrate them bishops, and Took does so. He consecrates them from laymen to deacons, to priests, the bishops, over the course of 2 days or something. And eventually, they held to this idea of the 2 Paul VIs, and they believed that Paul VI was a prisoner in the Vatican. But when Paul VI dies, Dominguez says he has this, Clement Dominguez y Gomez, he says that he has this vision of Saints Peter and Paul, which we already talked about before in sedevacantism, the idea that Saints Peter and Paul would come down from heaven and ordain a pope. He saw a vision of Saints Peter and Paul coming down from heaven and ordaining him the pope after the death of Paul VI, and therefore he would become Gregory the 17th and found the Palmer de Troyan, Palmarian Christian Church, which is, a cult. He's a cult leader. There's numerous stuff that goes on with this, where he does a lot of sexual impropriety, has sex with a lot of different people, his followers. The man's super exorbitant donations be given to his church, bans their followers from talking to their family outside of the church, bans their followers from access to media such as movies, television, and newspapers, demands that they live in poverty, demands that they move out to the middle of nowhere in the desert, where he builds their church, which is basically a compound, the Basilica of Le Palmer de Troya, radically changes Catholic doctrine, radically changes, they were supposed to be traditionalists, the Mass. I've heard that they only have the consecration in the Mass now. Apparently they tried to rewrite their own Bible. So anyway, he eventually passed away in 2005, and there has been successors. First, his right-hand man, Manuel Alfonso Carrel, was pope until 2011, and he took his name, Peter II. And so that's interesting. And he has Palmarian councils. They canonize Franco. They canonize Columbus and all these right-wing, glorious Spanish figures throughout history. And I believe they say that Joseph was assumed into heaven, and that Mary is also present in the Eucharist, and all kinds of absurd things. So eventually Peter II dies, and he's succeeded by Gregory XVIII. And Gregory XVIII runs off with a nun and apostatizes from the church. And since then, they've elected Peter III, and it's fallen into decline. There was actually a comedy in Spain made about them, about how Clement and Manuel were a gay couple. And Palmer de Troya was a fraud. Just really fascinating, really interesting stuff, and very tragic and sad. Vatican II never actually happened. Now, in a lot of these conspiracy icebergs, you always have this never actually happened, and it's at the bottom, so I made Vatican II never actually happen. But this isn't a pure meme, because sometimes you'll have traditionalists that say Vatican II isn't a real council, and therefore there's only 20 councils of the church, because it was a pastoral council. And so it never actually happened, it never legally happened. Next up, we have Bishop Schuckardt, Loyalist. Bishop Schuckardt was the original leader of the CMRI. He was kicked out. It was alleged that he had sexual improprieties. And it's said, I don't know if there's any truth to this, but it's said that he was eventually caught on drug trafficking charges and spent time in prison. But until his death, there were loyalists to him. Next up, we have Richard Ibrani. Richard Ibrani is a very, very interesting fringe figure. He runs St. John the Baptist website and Mary's Little Remnant. Ibrani is a rather extreme set of occultist in that he doesn't just believe that Pius XII was the last pope. He believes that Pope John the 19th, I believe, was the last pope, and that set of occultism has been sustained for the last 900 years, and that, the infamous Benedict IX, who sold the papacy, he was the beginning of the anti-popes. And so he's opposed to the Rosary, he's opposed to the Vulgate, and he thinks several of the doctors of the church are anti-doctors. He, of course, started out his spiritual journey, though, in the Most Holy Family Monastery. Next up, we have Fatima was a UFO and the church covered it up. This is a claim held by John Keel and Jacques Vallée. And there's a lot of UFOologists that basically think that Fatima was a UFO and the Miracle of the Sun was a UFO. And so they hold that Fatima had nothing to do with Catholicism, or that it was only very loose and it would have been heretical in Catholicism. And then the papacy or the Curia basically covered up that it wasn't a UFO and changed everything to be orthodox. Next up, we have dogmatic geocentrism. Geocentrism is, of course, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, or at least the center of the solar system, and that the sun and all the other planets are rotating around the Earth. Within young Earth creationism, there is a small faction of modern geocentrists, the most famous of which is Robert Sungenis. And so some geocentrists will point to the Bible, the Church Fathers, and the Galileo affair, and they'll say that the Catholic Church has infallibly declared that geocentrism is true, and that it's dogmatic that you have to believe in geocentrism, and if you doubt it, you're going to go to hell. Next up, we have Catholics worship Dagon. Now, Dagon is a Philistine god. He is one of the antagonists against the Hebrew people in the Bible, and one of the wicked gods of the people of Canaan, the Canaanites. And there's this weird, odd thing that a lot of conspiracy people or radical Baptists point to, and they say that Catholics worship Dagon because a mitre looks like a fish head or something. Next up, we have Pope St. Michael I, pray for us, in quotation marks. That was just made into a meme surrounding Pope Michael, and it's put into quotation marks because I didn't want anybody to think that I believe in that. But if Pope Michael was the first pope to succeed Pius XII, one would think he would have been a great saint. Therefore, if you follow Michael too, Pope Michael probably is a saint. Next up, we have threatening to become Anglican. a lot of traditional Catholics will threaten to become Orthodox because in their minds the Orthodox Church has maintained its liturgy and it's socially conservative, and so it is what they want the Catholic Church to be, and so they'll say, I'm going to leave Catholicism and become Orthodox if Francis does this. Well, there's the offside. Threatening to become Anglican, you get to have a Western Rite high liturgy, and you don't have to deal with eating crow about saying that the Pope can't do something or having to believe in papal infallibility. And so you could threaten to become Anglican. And if you're Anglican, you don't have to go to confession. So, and that was pointed out by Father Shikata in his tracts, as he said, well, if sedevacantism is wrong, that means that the church is defected. So, become Anglican. They don't have confessions and they have nice music. So, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Whole Universe. This is a schismatic church which is led by Tomislav Vlaslik, who was the Franciscan priest that was the former spiritual director to the Medjugorje Seers, who was accused of sexual misconduct, laicized, and excommunicated by the Vatican. And since then, he says that he sees apparitions of the Virgin Mary, our Lord, angels, and numerous saints, and they have led him to create the cult known as the Church of Jesus Christ of the Whole Universe, which has a lot of New Age stuff, a lot of Medjugorje type oddness, kind of like Mormon-y stuff in it, and I believe I've heard UFO religion stuff. So I think it's interesting with people that are pro-Medjugorje here, because the spiritual advisor to the seers at Medjugorje became a seer himself and founded his own cult. So, the Bible is idolatry. My friend Argent told me that he had met a guy that believed that the Bible was idolatry and that it was the center of Protestantism and numerous heresies, and that the church is far more important than the Bible, obviously. So, to prevent heresies from breaking out, the Catholic Church should take all the Bibles and destroy them so that heresies can never break out again. And therefore, the Catholic Church would continue without having a scripture somehow. And it would not be plagued by heresies like Protestantism. Next up, we have rel, or /rel/ or whatever you want to say it. So, rel was a 8chan board and a Facebook page where it's supposed to be called religiously intolerant, but there wasn't very many non-Christians. There was a handful of Protestants, probably most of the time pretty conservative, like Missouri Synod type Lutherans, but the majority of it was Eastern Orthodox who had converted, and Catholics, often pretty traditionalist. And so rel was a giant flame war ongoing between the Orthodox and the Catholics with a lot of scandals. And I was on there, and it was a pretty interesting period. I think it's gone now. I tried to look at it the other day, and I don't think any more new posts have been made. Just something that's really obscure, and I wanted to put it on the Iceberg as an Easter egg. Next up, we have OurLadyIsGod.com. Our Lady of God is a very cursed, very dark, very evil part of the internet, which should be destroyed for all time. And I don't think you can even access the website anymore every time I try to access it. And so this is at the very bottom of the iceberg for good reasons. It is run by a guy named Dominic Sanchez Flower. He lives in Cebu City in the Philippines, and he has been given some knowledge, I don't know through private revelation or what, but he believes that Mary is God and that Jesus is Satan. It's almost unreadable if you look into it. It's very bizarre. So I've had people tell me that he doesn't believe that. In fact, he also believes that Mary, the Mother of God in the Bible, is evil, but actually Our Lady, in some kind of Gnostic sense, is not the same as the Virgin Mary of the Bible, and she is this greater God like Sophia in Sethian Gnosticism or something like that, like the true God, and that the Mother of God is, and Jesus and, the Holy Trinity, that's a demiurge. I don't know. because every time I even look at it, it hurts my eyes, and it's giant wall text of craziness, and it's cursed as hell, and it's terrible. Just terrible. Horrible stuff. It's freaky and it's weird. Now we have Bishop Arnold Matthew. Arnold Matthew was an extremely bizarre character. He was an old Catholic bishop who had earlier been a Catholic and an Anglican. And he is really the beginning of old Catholics giving anybody an episcopal consecration. And so there's numerous bishops that trace their heritage back to Arnold Matthew. And because they would give basically anybody these old Catholic orders through Arnold Matthew's orders, it's basically like a form of occultism. It's like an occult ritual. And so people that aren't even Christians will end up being consecrated as a form of white magic. And that there's a bunch of like Gnostics running around and crazy people running around and like Satanists and stuff running around with these holy orders because they became so widespread and so easy to get. And so basically now there's Satanists running around that may be consecrated as bishops and are able to possibly celebrate the host. So just a very strange character that ended up having numerous bishops descend from him with very dubious holy orders and very dubious ideas about Christianity. And finally, we have the final one. Actually reading through the documents of Vatican II and trying to understand them instead of just reading random posts on the internet. And that's basically, just putting that on there is why I made the entire iceberg chart to begin with. Is I feel like nobody actually reads the documents of Vatican II. They just believe what they're told to about the documents, and they never actually go out to read them for themselves and try and understand them within their own context and understand them within the hermeneutic of continuity. And that doesn't just go for sedevacantists and more radical trads that are saying that Vatican II is a disruption or a modernist council. That also goes to the whole spirit of Vatican II crowd and liberals saying that it is this huge disruption, but that's a good thing. So anyway, that completes the traditional Catholic iceberg. I know that I've left out things here. Hopefully in the future I'll have a list of all the things I left out. And I'm talking months ahead because this has been a whole lot of work to make this whole thing. But with a list of the things I left out, I'll make an additional video of those things and I'll make an updated version of this chart where I get rid of all my typos and such. But if you made it through all this entire iceberg, I want to say thank you so much. And I want to ask you to pray for me and pray for the church.